All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, buongiorno e buonasera a tutti. So my name is Jana Ilievska. I am board member and membership secretary of the Pirandello Society of America and also humanities teaching fellow in the Department of Comparative Literature and in the College at the University of Chicago. I would like to welcome you all, our guests and all our viewers today to the first meeting of our initiative Pirandello On Air. It's a series of interviews with Pirandello scholars and friends organized by the Pirandello Society of America. I will be your host for these events, mostly moderating and just asking the questions to incite some content and interview, so to say, our guests in the next few months. And you can follow us live or watch later the recorded version of these meetings on our Facebook page, even if you don't have an account, where you can find the full program. So they will be recorded and uploaded again to our website and to our brand new YouTube channel. So we would like to kickstart the new year and our interviews with our first session today, in which you will have the opportunity to meet some of the board members of the Pirandello Society of America and learn more about our history, our mission, our work, and talk about the challenges of bringing Pirandello to Anglophone audiences, as well as the role of Pirandello and his works in the 21st century. So we have with us today the co-president and president for the past 20 years or so of the Pirandello Society of America, Jana Bazzoni from CUNY, and co-president Michael Subialka from UC Davis. The editors of the Journal of the Pirandello Society of America, Lisa Sarti from CUNY and Michael Subialka, Stefano Boselli, which is our theater and performance outreach unit firm, also from CUNY, and Enza de Francisci from Glasgow, Scotland, UK, formerly Europe, representative of our sister organization in the United Kingdom, the Society for Pirandello Studies. So I would like to start out with Jana. Jana is a professor and chair of the Department of Communication Studies at Baruch College at CUNY. She has been, as I said, the president of the Pirandello Society of America for quite a while, and she has published widely on Pirandello and film, Edoardo Sanguinetti, communication and theater. And before she pursued an academic career, she was in advertising. So I guess I have a pretty good critic here of all my webmastering and advertising plans for the Pirandello Society. And currently, as I said, she's the co-president of the PSA together with Michael Subialka. So Jana, can you start us off by telling us a little bit about the history of the PSA, who founded it, when, with what intentions, what are some of the challenges in the beginning, what are some of the challenges now, etc., whatever you would like to share.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for this initiative on our behalf. And hello, everybody else, and everybody out there. I wasn't there at the beginning, despite what you might think. But in 1958, the Society was born, largely through, although I don't have the notes if there are any of the, or minutes from the first meeting. Marta Abba, who was Pirandello's, let's say, desired love, and his, more importantly, perhaps his primary actress in from her 20th or 20-something year on, past his death, into stints on Broadway in two different plays, largely through Pirandello's promotion, encouragement, and no doubt funding at some point. So the story goes, and it's in the history that is outlined in our PSA, which is our journal. It's outlined there to kind of create a history of the past that comes up to nearly the present, as we try to keep it to one page and have everybody still be able to read it. It seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? 1958, you weren't even there, probably. Well, some of you in the audience won't have been there. I was there, but barely. and I certainly wasn't part of Pirandello. So Marta Abba was the focus for Pirandello in America. He hated America. He came twice, and in our latest journal, does this work? I don't know if this works. Our latest journal picture shows one of the people he met, and I think you know by his hairdo who he might have been. The one with the hat is, no, does he have a hat? No. The balder and shorter is Luigi Pirandello, and the person to his left and our right, I guess, is a scientist with the biggest hair in, and he had about 10 minutes with him, maybe. We don't know what they talked about. But that was his best time in the US. He complained about almost everything about the United States. So it's kind of ironic, but it's also his fault because he encouraged Marta Abba. He made her learn English so that she could perform first in England and then in New York and Broadway, because even he'd like it or not, knew that Broadway would be the place that she should be as the kind of prima donna of Italian theater at the time. So by 1958, she had been married to an American, a very rich American, from whom she fairly quickly got divorced after, and I'm sure with a good settlement. I don't know if they had prenups in those days, but I think she managed well to sort of go in high society in one way or another. But that also meant living in Ohio, and that wasn't quite what she had in mind when she was briefly on Broadway and got decent reviews in the part of a servant, which would be kind of strange, but from her prima donna status. But she apparently was lovely and managed a Russian accent of some sort. I didn't even know that there were could have been Russian servants at that point, but maybe the Romanovs. At any rate, the play I've never read, but the whole purpose of the society and her drawing room or living room in New York as the place where they all met was to create a place for production of Pirandello's plays. And while her love was passionate as his, they both had in their minds the continuation of his life's work. And she was the vehicle for that, not only through the plays that they did together on a tour or several tours in Europe and in South America, but also in the writing of, I think it's 3 plays, specifically as vehicles for her. And so she was, much to the consternation of the family, given ownership of the rights to those plays, translated herself, supposedly, into English for performance here. And they have been performed. They've been published in English and performed, and others can speak to that if that's part of what their interests are. But I think it is this sort of key romance, at least on one part, an obsession, I would think, of the romance on his part, of an older man with a younger woman has been a story for many a season. So we could still appreciate that. So quickly after that, what did we do? We never met Marta Abba, at least I never did. But 10 years later, we had the first president of that society, now called the Pirandello Society of America, or just the Pirandello Society. And in between, they produced performances when they could, but not the society itself. They promoted, which is still the quote that we use is again in the journal, is basically to promote the works and help scholars to improve on the scholarship in whatever languages. So because Pirandello's success, which was only in part facilitated by the presence of the Pirandello Society of America, and that comparable or comparable part of society in the British Isles, the England and still Ireland, right? That spread around the world, that and his tours. So from the beginning, this society had both scholarship, because the scholars were involved from the beginning at Columbia University and elsewhere. We went into the MLA, which is the Modern Language Association, for the first time in 1969, and we've been members as an association since then. So it's spread through both scholarship and performance. And one of the frustrations, if you will, of the membership in probably any other country other than Italy is that we are just one of many kinds of organizations trying to do the same thing. I think we've got a better opening story. That may be just my prejudice. So I don't know. I think that's enough for me for a while.
That is quite a story, I have to say, with Marta Abba. So I know that I've read some of Pirandello's letters and many of the novels. He does comment on the U.S. as being America being this fast place full of madness and people who are dropping dead because they're having heart attacks because they're so busy and they're just running down the street and not having the time to greet anyone. So I guess that was kind of his original impression of the United States. Did he then warm up to it eventually? I wonder. Probably not. Yeah. Jana, so one more question, or anyone else can respond. So how was it well received in the beginning, Pirandello, in the United States when the society started spreading his works? And as I understand, our society was initially theater oriented to promoting his work. So Pirandello was, I guess, first seen as primarily a playwright in the United States. And how did that pick up? Was he well received? What are some of the comments? Jana, I think if you can say a few words to that as well.
I muted because of a phone call, which I forgot to turn off the landline. So sorry. So the first productions that I know about were actually very early, both in the British Isles and so in London and in New York on Broadway, or the version of Broadway that existed in 1921. They presented 6 characters in search of an author. So from the ground up, it was in London or his plays were in, and those productions were quite well thought of. There was a Russian director for the one that appeared in New York, and I don't remember if it was the same director. I think probably it was the same production, but I'm not positive. Somebody else can speak to that. And I wouldn't say the world ended at that time, but certainly that the English-speaking population, who were, of course, seeing the play in their own countries, but only had read about in sort of People kinds of magazines and other kinds of things that traveled across the seas. So, but it began there. 1921 on, you get much more of an international presence for Pirandello and much more visible success for all the reasons we know. Talk about promotional items in the past. So promotion was always a part of it, and it has waned sometimes, but it is now all over the world with millions of scholarly articles, books, and many performances. Although, as we know, performance gets harder and harder through the many dollars or whatever the national currency is. That said, small theaters, which had flourished in this country and elsewhere, have taken up the torch for that. And it's a regular, in many ways, across small theaters off Broadway.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jana. So from Marta Abba's living room, drawing room, here we are in our own living rooms and in this venue. So Stefano, if you can comment a little bit on what Jana said about theater, about how, what was the initial reception of Pirandello. So Stefano Boselli is a New York-based stage director, producer, dramaturg, and teaching artist. He currently teaches theater courses in the Department of Performing and Fine Arts at York College and the English program at Centenary University, in addition to a performance-oriented version of great works of literature in the Department of English at CUNY. MFA, he has an MFA in stage directing from the School of Dramatic Art Paolo Grassi in Milano, and he specialized in acting and directing with, I am sorry if I butchered the name, Yuli Alshitz,
Yeah,
the Russian Academy of
the
Dramatic.
Russian name.
Incredible. So actually in Moscow, and he has worked as stage director in Milano, Parma, and more recently in New York City. Stefano.
Yes, so, well, first of all, I wanted to comment a little bit on the difficulties of actually staging Pirandello, and I think, maybe one is just that, European playwrights didn't have a lot of luck in America. If we think of Brecht, he just at some point was in California, couldn't do much of his life, and he went back for other reasons too. But so for Pirandello, traditionally, there have been really problems of acculturation, of translation. Just simply, sometimes the titles they're not catchy enough in English translation, whereas in Italian maybe they seem deep, but in English they seem shallow. I think that's one aspect that has been a problem. Then I would say the there's like always like a philosophical framework that encompasses Pirandello's major plays, at least. And in America, traditionally, actors have been and directors have been trained in a very so Strasberg-like method of acting, usually, which tends to privilege emotions, personal experiences, etc. So that philosophical aspect is not fully comprehended all the time. And I think that's been one of the major problems, really. Also in England. And there really aren't many studies. I mean, I know that there are studies on English productions and why those succeeded or not in translation. Maybe Enza can say more about that. But in America, not much, and that may well be one of the reasons. There's not enough productions to look at overall. So those are two major problems, I think, of connection. Actually, I was looking at the film productions, and there aren't many either of Pirandello. I think there should be more. Usually, it's the 6 characters in search of an author that has really had a lot of the major plays that has really had resonance. So there's this adaptation by Paul Avila-Meyer in a Hollywood studio. I don't know if you guys saw that. So that's very an American, really American version of the theater, but in a Hollywood cinema studio, directed by Stacy Keach. And then there's not much else. There are some, kind of online conference lecture type adaptation of the play, but not much else. Another, I think, major problem that has been resolved in different ways recently is the sheer amount of words that the plays contain. We're in a situation much like Shakespeare today, where there are so many words, but we're used to a much tighter type of dramaturgy, of playwriting, and so there are long speeches that are just not. Sometimes they're cut. So adapters today, when recent adaptations, for example, Henry IV, have really cut a lot. With I think unequal results. Sometimes you really feel that the lack of that kind of, again, philosophical depth that is in those works. But I confess that, so with the Pirandello Society sponsorship, at some point I directed a reading of The Giants of the Mountain, and I know Jana was there. I don't know if Lisa was there, I don't remember. But it was a reading, so we with performance. So it was a stage reading. There were performance artists, people who are drawing the characters as described in the detailed stage directions that Pirandello gives. So that was a performative aspect, and then we're actors reading. But even in that case, even if I had cut the script of The Giants of the Mountain, which is already a reduced script because it wasn't finished, and it was cut in preparation for that particular reading and performance, I had to cut about another 20, 30 pages from the final production because it really felt too heavy. So it's always a balance, really a balancing act. Then there have been various productions of Pirandello that, but lately I've been more focused on South America. So I've been looking at those South American productions, and in the upcoming lecture conversation, I'll talk more probably about that. Pirandello in Argentina, actually. Wrote a chapter of a book on that's coming up, but I will talk about a particular production in Argentina, because that has been a country that has been particularly open to even now to staging Pirandello and the philosophical depth.
With someone like Borges coming there, I guess they'll have more of a palette for this kind of writing.
Yes. South America has always been very receptive to that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, Stefano. So to sum up, it's so there is a problem of translation, if I understand correctly. The titles simply are not catchy enough, and I noticed this. I studied Sigira, Quaderni di Serafino Gubbio, and in English it's just shoot the notebooks. Like how do you even sell that? It's just like an American student wouldn't pick that up in a bookstore necessarily. And many Il Fumatia Pascal, even that doesn't work necessarily in English. So first, the titles are a problem. The philosophical component seems to be a problem for American audiences. And then finally, you said the words, the length of the soliloquies, the many soliloquies in a Pirandello play, so to say. Yeah, the philosophical aspect, I can definitely comment on that. Michael and I had a conversation about it recently, where I saw a kind of an adaptation of 6 characters in a search of an author mixed with the mountain giants, and it was very funny. It was comical. There were a lot of quarterbacks in it, and references to American football. The audience had a grand time, but I exited that performance thinking that's not Pirandello. Pirandello is not comical. He's humoristic, which is, as you know, something quite different. So there is a discrepancy there for sure. Right. Stefan, I'll come back to you later. Lisa, so if you would like to comment on that, I will just briefly introduce you. Lisa has taught at Hunter College and at Princeton, and is currently associate professor in modern languages at the Borough of Manhattan Community College at CUNY. Her main field of research is fin de siècle visual culture, Italian theater, and early cinematography, as well as the intersection of literature and the performing arts. She has published articles on Arrigo Boito, melodrama, female artists of the Café Chantant, the prose of Annie Vivanti, American musical theater, and Pirandello storytelling and theater, as well as his cinematic adaptation of the short stories. So, Lisa, anything you'd like to share?
Thank you, Anna, and hello, everybody. Before I start talking about my involvement with PSA, I just wanted to comment on something that Stefano just said, because it's quite ironical that, Stefano was mentioning this idea of, the philosophical aspect of Pirandello's works that is not perceived or appreciated enough, which makes me think of the fact that Pirandello actually complained for the greatest part of his life about being, being accused of being too philosophical and too cerebral. If you just read his interviews, or his letters to Martha Abba, or even just his notes, he kept repeating, "I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a philosopher. Stop calling me a philosopher. I'm not." And he really wanted to be appreciated for the opposite, right? For his idea, according to him, to present just life as it is, from a very real and practical perspective. So which makes me think of how perspectives are different somehow, because he was actually seeing all this from a totally opposite perspective. But anyways, going back to my involvement.
And I just remembered, wasn't it Benedetto Croce who even said, "You're not a philosopher. This is just pseudo philosophy. Stop writing that." So I guess there were people who perceived that.
That's funny for sure. But well, it's also true that Italian students, when you do Pirandello with them, even if it's just a short story or a play or a novel, they complain about the language. It's too difficult. Sentences are too long. The words are too big, and they are struggling all the time. At the same time, when you do this with American students, well, we cannot even start listing all the complaints that we receive from them about, the themes, the wording in the sentences. So it's definitely not an easy offer, to teach nowadays. That's for sure. But yes, so I just wanted to say a few words about my personal involvement with PSA, because I think it's I really had to ask myself, how long have I been doing this? Because I said, when did it start? And I, believe it or not, I had to look through my emails, super old emails, even the email address I'm no longer using, the one that I used when I moved here. And I realized that I actually started in 2009. And so, it's way over 10 years. And I think it all started in the cafeteria at the CUNY Graduate Center when I had my first meeting with Susan Teneriello. She's not here, but she's still very much involved with the society as the press editor. And I remember I had this conversation with her because at the time the society was looking for someone, possibly a graduate student who we had some interest in Pirandello, who might be able to help with the society. So that's how I started, as managing editor and having this meeting with other society members. And I have to be honest with you that I consider this experience really my first American experience with teamwork. That's really how I learned myself to work in a team, group work, something that actually I was totally unfamiliar with because I was coming from Italy. I can say anything for now, but at that time it wasn't very popular, to meet with other colleagues or even graduate students and have like this conversation where you could like discuss your ideas and share your thoughts and like brainstorm together. That's the first time I really learned the meaning of this verb, brainstorming. And it was just an amazing chance for me to grow, in intellectual terms. So it's just impressive now for me to say that the society has grown tremendously since 2009. There is no comparison with the society now and how it was. I'm not saying that it's better or worse. It's just very different because the society evolved, just like time evolves. And at the same time, I evolved myself with the society. So that's really the lesson I'm taking home from this experience with the society, because, you know, there I found colleagues, I found like intellectual partners. You know, I think that now, while I'm talking right now, there is a book that is being printed right now. It's my second project with Michael. So you see that I am co-editing the journal with him. We are writing together. We are brainstorming a lot together. So, and our second book together is coming out on Pirandello e l'immagine. So, I mean, it was just for me personally, being part of this society was a chance for intellectual growth. And for this, I'm really very grateful I had this opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. That's how I feel as well now as a young scholar starting out in the field. And I think Pirandello would really appreciate it, because at the end of the day, that kind of emanates from everything that he writes, this desire to create community around himself, to listen to people too. At the end, I have a little quote from one of the novels where one of his characters says precisely this: I want to just bring everyone into myself and listen to them and make them brothers, and make them understand each other, even if just for a moment. And the book that Lisa was referring to is called Pirandello e la visualità tra arte, filosofia e psicanalisi. It's currently in print, and Lisa, Carlo Di Lieto, and Michael Subialka wrote it together, and we're going to present it in a few weeks here in this venue. So Michael, coming to you now. Michael is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature and Italian at the University of California, Davis. He has published and taught widely on literature and philosophy, 19th, 20th century culture, comparative modernism. Pirandello's visual philosophy, as I just said, is the first book that he wrote together with Lisa Sarti, published in 2017, I think, Michael, right? 2017. And there are many, many things I could say about Michael's biography. He's in complete and in Italian, and does philosophy, and has co-directed a few plays when he was at Oxford, so he can speak to many aspects of Pirandello. Michael, do you want to tell us something about the journal, about the conferences that Pirandello Society of America is organizing, and of course share some anecdotes of your own about how you came in touch with Pirandello and how you still stayed in touch with Pirandello?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this, Anna, and to everyone for being here. Actually, as Lisa was sort of talking about her experience with the society and the way that it sort of evolved and she evolved, and that sort of sense of the growing together, I was thinking of my own experience as well. So I'll start by answering your question there, I think. Because I think that actually was sort of my experience as well, Lisa, in a very real sense. I think that the first time I ever went to the MLA convention, I can't remember what year it was, but I was still a graduate student. And I think I was presenting on a panel that was sponsored by the Pirandello Society of America. And that was the first time that I met Jana. And that was sort of my introduction to the society as a presenting member. I actually had been a member of the society from longer back, though. I remember this because when I was still an undergraduate, I was doing an Italian major at the University of Notre Dame, and Professor John Welly there was teaching the sort of senior seminar capstone course. And every year there was a different senior seminar, and it was just on whatever topic the professor wanted to choose for that year. And John Welly chose to teach it on Pirandello that year, which was a kind of happy chance for me because, of course, that was my first exposure to Pirandello. And obviously I was infatuated and just really interested in Pirandello's work. And at the end of that class, I remember that John suggested that people who were really interested should join the Pirandello Society of America and become members so they could get the journal. And so I did that. And as a student, I think, membership was quite cheap. It wasn't a big investment. And I got the journal. And that was, I think, the beginning of my interaction, so to speak, with the society. And then as a graduate student, a few years later, I presented on a panel at the MLA. And it's just continued to sort of grow with me as part of my career over all this time, because my passion for Pirandello and interest in his work, which is just so conceptually rich, but also such, I think, telling window into his time period, right? I think that that's one of the things that makes him really fascinating as well. In addition to just how compelling his work can be to read, is that he really is at the center of this kind of modernist transformation, not only of the theater, which is obviously what he won the Nobel Prize for, his transformation of the stage, but also sort of literature and the way that sort of the intermediality of this period, bringing together multiple sort of media and forms and trying to experiment with them. He obviously was in the thick of things, as Jana was showing the cover of one of our previous journal, right? In terms of meeting people like Einstein and having these conversations. You know, he's really a sort of central figure for this moment, I think, in many ways, which is part of what I think really makes me interested in him as well. So speaking of the conferences which you had asked about, one of the things that that Jana mentioned is that actually the Pirandello Society of America became part of the MLA, the Modern Language Association, very early on. And as an affiliate organization, we sponsor every year a panel at the MLA convention to make sure that there's a continued presence of this sort of scholarly interest and work on Pirandello, as well as the way that he relates to other figures and movements from his time and from later. We've also had panels on the reception of Pirandello and things like that. Lisa also has been organizing for the last several years at this point, a sort of sister panel, we could call it, or something like that, at the Northeastern Modern Language Association meetings, which happen annually as well. So we've had this kind of ongoing presence in these academic conferences, which for me was really formative because that's actually how I got involved, and then sort of gradually became a co-editor of the journal and now the co-president of the society. So sort of over time getting more and more involved that way. But it's also an opportunity, I think, for younger scholars to make similar kinds of connections, like what Lisa was talking about before. And then to kind of address the first part of your question last and talk about the journal a little bit. As Jana was mentioning when she was talking about the kind of history of the society, which is really rich and goes back a long way. Likewise, the journal has a kind of rich and varied history. So it started out quite a while ago, less as a kind of sort of major academic publication in its initial years and more as a kind of newsletter about the society and what was going on. And then it kind of evolved over time to become increasingly scholarly, and at some point the name actually changed to what we have currently, the PSA, which is the Journal of the Pirandello Society of America. And I've been involved in the journal now for, I should have thought of that ahead of time and counted the years, but long enough. Sort of first as a kind of assistant editor helping out, and then eventually sort of getting involved in the editorship more directly. And I'm really just so proud of what we've accomplished over the last several years, because the volumes have been getting sort of bigger, not just in the physical sense, although that's true too, which obviously we have to watch our expenses on that. But it's also getting, I think, bigger in terms of the scope of the ways that we're kind of making connections with international colleagues and the ways that we're drawing in scholars from different fields and also from across the world. And this year, for example, we're actually I'm working with Lisa and with Enza de Francisci together. The three of us are co-editing a special issue to commemorate the centenary of the first performance of 6 characters in search of an author, which was in 1921. So we have a special issue coming out, which will be, I think, really a really good contribution to renovating and kind of transforming contemporary English language scholarship about this seminal play and the kind of moment that it represents in theater history. And we have some wonderful contributors who are going to be part of that. So I think there's a lot going on in the journal right now. In addition to this sort of scholarship, we've also expanded it, and I've worked with Lisa to do this over the last several years, to include a section that is dedicated to conversations with practitioners in the theater and with translators, with all sorts of people who are involved in the diffusion and promotion and study of Pirandello in different ways than just the academic essay, so to speak. So we've had conversations with directors, with producers, with all sorts of people in some of the recent issues there. And we've also sort of redoubled our efforts to include translations of Pirandello's works in the journal as well. And so all of the recent issues have involved translations of his short stories, especially the short stories, but also sometimes there have been translations of other genres of work. Obviously, as any sort of Pirandello scholar probably is aware, we face the difficulty in English that there still is no complete translation of Pirandello's short stories in English. In other languages like German, you have a total sort of complete works approach, but that's never happened in English. So there's still works. There are also works of theater and in his other genres, right, that haven't been translated. So we're sort of really dedicated to that in the journal as well. As well as there's also a section which we've had and that we're proud of that includes creative works, some of which is sort of inspired in different ways by Pirandello. We often have sort of short one-act plays or dramatic monologues that people offer and that we are able to publish. And we also have had, poems, for example, that were inspired by Pirandello. So there's sort of a multi-genre, multi-faceted approach in the journal that I think is really rich and that kind of continues that original legacy in a way of keeping Pirandello alive, not only in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of creative work and diffusing his work in different ways and making him present for an American audience in different ways. So that's what the journal is about. And I encourage anyone who's listening to subscribe. And you can do that by becoming a member. We have access now on our website to past issues of the journal, as well as you would then get the print issue of the journal coming up. So I certainly encourage that. And if you have any questions, you can obviously reach out to us about it. I don't know I hope I have answered all your questions, Anna.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Enza. So Enza is a lecturer in translation studies at the University of Glasgow and program director of the Glasgow Nankai China Master of Sciences in Translation Studies double degree. She has published widely on theater translation, performance history, dialect literature, and a recent publication includes her monograph, A New Woman in Verga and Pirandello, From Page to Stage. It came out in 2018. And she has also co-edited a volume, Shakespeare, Italy and Translational Exchange, Early Modern to Present from 2017. And would you like to tell us something about our sister organization in the United Kingdom, the Society for Pirandello Studies? What is your mission? When were you founded? What were the original intentions? How is that going? How is it working? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for the invitation for today's session, which is such a brilliant initiative. I've never really been in a PSA a collaboration like this before, so thank you very much. And I wanted to also start a bit like Lisa did by talking about the collaborations that we've been having with the PSA, with Michael and Lisa. As Michael just said, we're co-editing a volume, a special edition on 6 characters to mark the centenary, and Michael has been a long-standing member as well for us in the Society for Pirandello Studies back in the UK. So I've really enjoyed the synergies between our societies, and that's been really, really great. I also wanted to pick up on Stefano's brilliant points earlier about the translatability or untranslatability of Pirandello, and something that's been really fun for me is I kind of migrated from the Italian department to translation studies, and it's really fun to bring Pirandello to a translation class and talk about the problems with translation, or Pirandello in translation. And one of our anecdotes, we talk about the untranslatability of his titles, and this is something that Professor Susan Basnett often talks about whenever she gives a special lecture for us. And titles like Così è vi pare in English, that is quite a mouthful too. And so I really appreciate the comments that you said earlier, Stefano. I totally agree with all of those points. But I was wondering while you were talking whether the problem with the translatability or untranslatability of Pirandello is something linked to the broader question about the lack of translated Italian theatre in the UK, and I don't know about the US or in Europe. I know we're out of the EU now, but so I was just wondering about which kind of playwrights enter the canon. This is something that I'm thinking at the moment. Which translated playwrights enter the canon? We have, you know, Ibsen, Chekhov. We're lucky enough to have Pirandello, I think, especially in the UK, to be one of those canonical translated playwrights. But again, what gets translated? And it's usually 6 characters. Even what gets translated, what does not get translated, who gets translated, and who does not get translated are just really questions at the moment at the heart of my research. So what you were saying today, Stefano, really you know, kind of ringed out and tied in with the kind of questions that have been on my mind recently. So thank you for that. So in terms of the Society for Pirandello Studies, our history is not as rich as the one that Jana just described. So we started in 1980s. I wasn't there, obviously, when it began. And it was founded by Felicity Firth in University of Bristol. And then it continued to develop. I joined in 2013. And at that time, Dara O'Connell was our secretary, and he was stepping down. And I was just a keen PhD student in those days. I really wanted to get more involved. So I was like, Dara, you know, do you mind if I organize the next conference? I was at UCL at the time, University College London, and we have the Bloomsbury Theatre. And there was recently, there was just a call going around saying, you know, if you would like free use of our theatre at the weekends, you know, why don't you apply? So I was like, you know, Dara, I could actually try to organize this. And I remember, I don't know if you would agree, Michael, but maybe some more skeptical members of the society were like, this is not going to work. It's too difficult. I said, no, let's just try. So through that initiative, I think that was, 2012, 13. We managed to fill up the Bloomsbury Theatre, and that was, to me, a really moving moment. Lisa was talking earlier about moments that really moved her, and for me, it was just looking at that theatre completely full, you know, and comparing it to previous meetings where we were back in Senate House, or just a few, you know, the usual, and to see the difference, to have like Professor Joe Farrell actually pat me on the back. It's like, well done. I was like, okay. And what was really special about that moment was just to see how much interest there was in Pirandello, and to see, you know, younger we had schools coming in to watch the performances. It was really the performances, which again ties in with what Stefano was saying, that kind of brought Pirandello to life and brought him, you know, to us. And the amount of interest that we also had from actors and directors, people eager just to get their work out, and all of these really creative rewritings of Pirandello, or, you know, his novels being turned into stage plays, and just seeing them performed in English, really low budget too, because we didn't have that much funding. So that was really, for me, a turning point. And just like Michael was saying, our journal, Pirandello Studies, has also developed, and we now have a section inspired by the kind of turnaround moment for our society, called the Behind the Scenes section. And that's what we use to interview playwrights and ask them about their journey. And I think that's really enriching. So it's not just a journal for academic studies, but it also, I hope, broadens out to maybe non-academic communities interested in Pirandello, who want to write, who want to contribute. So yeah, I agree with you, Anna. I think Pirandello would be really happy with us right now, and just happy not only that we're continuing to disseminate his works and his writings, but even just being together and working together. And so yeah, that's just me.
Thank you. I was curious. So when you work with the director, with the London director and staging Leola, were there any discrepancies in their idea of how they wanted to stage this play and your ideas? Were you what were some challenges that you encountered working with the director?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I was just really fortunate enough in 2013 to be invited by the National Theatre to help translate Pirandello's Leola. And I was the Sicilian expert or scholar who knew the Sicilian, who was able to translate. So I wasn't the literal translator. There was Jane Fallowfield, I think, who did the literal translation from the English version, from the Italian version, but I was brought in to comment on the Sicilian version. And this is a staging by Tanya Ronda and Richard Eyre, which I know Michael has written about as well. And what was fascinating was that they wanted to find out how the Sicilian had been put together, because clearly they had this literal translation, but there were going to be, terms and phrases that they couldn't understand, and they wanted to go back to the original version. And so I just kind of that's when I always tell my students, when you're lucky, you have your being in the right place in the right moment. I was literally just invited via friends to help Tanya Ronda, and we would just meet at the British Library when it was normal to have a coffee together, and just literally talk about the language. And to be really honest, I know I'm being recorded, but a lot of my research actually came from asking family members, like, what does this mean? What does this, proverb actually where does it come from? And these little nicknames, the nicknames are really hard to translate. So my aunt was actually really helpful and I was able to feed back to Tanya Ronda. But that, in a way, was a turning point as well, where I really kind of fell in love with my discipline in translation studies. First of all, it showed me that playwrights working on foreign plays like Italian or Sicilian didn't necessarily have to know the source language. They have a team behind them, and you can have scholars helping with non-standard languages. You have a literal translator. So that really opened my eyes to collaborative translation processes, which I literally, up until that moment, and maybe I'm naive and I realize I'm being recorded, but I always thought that they would just be a playwright translating the play. But it's not like that at all. There's a huge team behind the script. So that opened my eyes to collaborative translations. It opened my eyes to indirect translations. So Sicilian, being a non-standard language, gets translated via the major language. So what we see on stage are translations from Sicilian into Italian, and then the Italian gets translated into English or Chinese or whatever. But then what happens to the Sicilian? So that got me really passionate about non-standard languages, how to translate non-standard languages. And then the third thing was one of my first questions to Tanya Ronda was, are you going to get a Sicilian cast to perform this? Like, now in hindsight seems a bit naive, but she was like, no, we're thinking about broadening out and asking an Irish cast to come and perform, or at least actors with an Irish accent who could perform an Irish accent. And again, that just got me on another journey on how to translate cultures. There are no such thing as equivalent cultures, but yet there are cultures that are kind of similar. I mean, Ireland, Sicily, in socio-historical perspective, have had quite tricky histories with the major counterpart, with Northern Ireland gaining independence. Sicily has always had a bit of a problematic relationship or with mainland Italy. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details, but there were many studies that were saying that perhaps the mafia may have developed because Sicilians were left on their own to govern themselves. But it's been a tricky kind of history that both Sicily and Ireland, in a way, have shared. And in terms of the language, if the director and the playwright had just ordinary English accents or RP accents, then you're not really honoring that the original play was written in a non-standard language. So how do you do that? How do you conserve that? So these accents help to do that. But then you also have kind of ethical issues. When my father was in the audience and he's like, so are you trying to tell me that these Irish actors are meant to be representing us? I'm like, yeah, kind of. And then it's quite a... So I know that there's a writer whose name I completely have just forgotten, and she talks about the dangers and all the danger you could have with misrepresenting one culture to another. And I think there is a slight danger. I appreciate the initiative by the playwright, but there is this danger of causing not offense, but it could be a kind of misrepresentation. And for me, and I've said this in my review, so was when the Irish actors were gesticulating in Sicilian or in Italian. Yeah, and that was borderline. I did interview the lead actor, and he said he refused to do that. But Luca Vullo, who's a Sicilian director, was actually invited.
I know.
Sorry,
It's
yeah,
my
he
world.
was invited to the theatre to help train the actors and how to gesticulate. Yeah, so for me, it's like it's one thing, one culture representing another, but it's another thing when there's a crossover, and it's that bit in the middle that I thought caused a bit of discomfort. So I don't want to take up the floor, but these were my initial thoughts.
Enza. So there are several layers of difficulties. It's not even so much just the translation of the titles and the kind of cerebral aspect of the works, but there's even a layer of cultures, because Pirandello is not just Italian, he is Sicilian in particular, and there is a specific way of speaking there, or maybe there's a specific worldview. I just spent 2 years there, and yes, I can kind of confirm that in many ways. And also comes in play, there is the nonverbal language that is present in his plays, that is quite important. All right, so we're coming to an end here. As a way to wrap up our session today, I would like to ask you, so how do we bring Pirandello closer to Anglophone audiences, to our students, even to non-academics in the United States and in the UK? How do we sell him, so to say, to use this contemporary academic jargon? And what is something, how do you see Pirandello being relevant to our times today, specifically now, if you want to comment on the pandemic situation that we're living through? How would it even be to stage 6 characters in search of an author through Zoom? Maybe actually that would be an excellent production. Maybe that would be the play appropriate for something like that. But if you all could take turns in answering, in commenting on this issue about how to bring him to our audiences, and what is something that you feel is relevant and speaks to us today from Pirandello's life and works. Lisa, go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking about a conversation that I recently had with my students last semester in my literature class. That class was not just on Pirandello, but Pirandello was one of the authors that we explored together. And I just realized how important it is for our students, for this specific generation, I would say, to find a way to personally relate to the authors that we are addressing in class. And every time they see an author that, who to them seems too distant in thinking or in feelings, in emotions, they immediately say, "Oh, I don't like him. I don't like her. I can't relate." This is a comment that I hear so many times. So I was thinking about Pirandello, and actually, when I was having this conversation with them, I was just trying to explain there are so many points in his poetics, in his thinking, that are possible points with which you can relate. And one of them, one for all, I would say this conversation that we always have when we deal with Pirandello about identity. So I was just trying to transform Pirandello's words into words that could be more accessible to them. We talk a lot about like having an avatar now. But, if you think, it's not so different about what Pirandello was saying about identity, about us wearing a mask, or about like presenting yourself for someone who you are not. And so that's how we started relating Pirandello to Facebook, to how you interact in social media, and how you just present a different side of yourself. So it was just like something that for them was just like a sort of a ringing bell, and I said, "Oh my God, yes, there are connections." So I would say I'm just telling you this story just because maybe as educators, as scholars, maybe we should find a way to find a new language, new words that can resonate with today's words, especially considering our millennials, our students, the people we have in class. And you see that, for example, if you ever happen to teach an author like Leopardi, I think Leopardi, I love him. He's really one of my favorite poets, but I believe it's probably one of the most difficult Italian authors that you can teach in class, because really students don't get his points. I mean, his pessimismo, they say, oh, it's too much. I mean, why? Why do you want to kill yourself? Why? And it's really, really difficult to explain to them what was actually moving him, his ideals, and so on and so forth. I think the same could be for Pirandello. I mean, Pirandello can be a very overwhelming author, definitely. I mean, and his language is super rich and wordy and sometimes difficult. But if we can find a way to simplify this and make it more accessible from our contemporary perspectives, I think that's the key to be successful.
I agree, absolutely. And I think he readily, easily lends himself to such a approximation to the times that we live today, especially social media and the technology we're surrounded by. Absolutely. Michael, Stefano, Jana. Stefano, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, I would say the awareness of the theatricality of life and existence. I think it's a major point that still attracts me in Pirandello, not just in the theater, of course, but especially in the theater, which is something we are seeing. So that the many layered truths that we can discover. And I was watching season after season of Survivor these days, where people are telling someone one truth and then behind their back they're doing something completely different. Well, that's Pirandello in action, I think. So those are, I think, are worth exploring. I just
yeah, all the world's a stage, and Pirandello with his masks, absolutely.
Right, he becomes a master of that, and once we are able to make that shift, I mean, Pirandello is really crucial in this history of theater. But then for today, I think it's like being aware of constantly being seen and seeing at the same time. I think it's a very powerful aspect of it. It still remains as a major achievement.
Yeah, while relatively recently also wearing literal masks, right? So there's layers and layers of masks on top of our faces now. Michael.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I was just going to add in that I think, this has been said already by several people, but I think that one of the key things also is continuing to stage these works, right? And maybe that requires adaptation, right? Maybe requires transformations that will make it more accessible than just a literal representation of something that would have maybe fit on the stage 100 years ago, but doesn't feel contemporary. That could be the case, that there are some ways in which adaptation is necessary. But I've seen some really successful stagings of some of Pirandello's works. When I was in England, I'm sure you saw as well, Enza, the staging at the National Theatre of it was actually a traveling production, right, from France, from Paris, that Théâtre de la Ville was doing an adaptation of 6 characters, which was a little bit surreal in the way that it presented its aesthetic, and it was kind of otherworldly and ghostly and a little creepy, but it was so hauntingly beautiful. It was really effective, right? And that production went across the globe, and I think that that continues the legacy. And it doesn't just have to be 6 characters. Of course, there are other works that could have a similar kind of effect. So I hope that we'll continue to see sort of innovations in the ways that Pirandello can be brought to the stage and brought to life, because I think that does a great deal. The other thing I was going to mention is there's a beautiful film. We were talking about the kind of lack of film adaptations, which is true, but there is a really beautiful film by the Taviani brothers called Chaos, right? Chaos, if you pronounce it with a bad English accent, right? And it's actually an adaptation of his short stories rather than the theater, and it's really beautiful. It's very long, but it's really beautiful. And even just if you're teaching a class, showing one of the, I think there are 5 short stories adapted in it, and even showing one of them, so maybe 20 minutes or something like that, there's just a lot to unpack. It's a great way to get sort of access to Pirandello, in a way that's visual and beautiful and sonorous and all of these things, and also engaging a lot of the kind of conceptual questions that make Pirandello so rich. So those sorts of things I think can be good inroads into opening up this world that then people get sort of hooked into, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Jana and Enza, would you like to add Jana, do you even have a message just for us, for your, for your PSA people here? How would you like us to bring forward the society? Anything you would like to share?
I wanted to just briefly say about what Michael was saying and what everybody else was saying in terms of bringing it to the current generation.
Yeah.
None of my children know anything about Pirandello, and they are not of the current generation. They are, but they're in their 30s and upward. Well, 30s, they're in their 30s. And they have no interest at all in anything I do. So I just associate that. But if I think about them, I completely can understand how we can do. If I was a director and an artist and all the things that are represented here, Stefano was very modest about his play, his production of the Mountain Giants. It was spectacular. Just the concept of introducing that, in a semicircle of actors, beautifully staged, and then these two artists working the walls with their paper, drawing the different characters and helping you see in this other way. So from that kind of thing, which was, let's say, poor theater in the sense that the pay wasn't much, it was upstairs, and it was definitely a New York off, but it was a wonderfully, first of all, designed and executed. We have a lot of actors in New York, but well cast and well derived in terms, and it's like all of the ideas that you already have and the kind of the experiences that you've explained of your own coming to Pirandello, or coming to collaboration, or coming, as Lisa just said, to students with something new. And I think right now is the time of TikTok, but it's also the time of storytelling. And storytelling is basically what it's about, whether it's, and I don't teach, and I have never been allowed to teach Pirandello. So I don't have that issue. But it's because the English department owns it, as Stefano could tell you. As anybody could tell you, if you're not in an Italian department, which is, I think, why collaboration hasn't happened as much as other places. There is, you have to work your way in to being accepted in Italian, or maybe any other language from your own. I think you've all done splendid work today and always, and I look forward to being able to read everything that's in PSA one of these days. Maybe I'll go back to trying to help edit, because I was editor years ago and I had no idea what I was doing, but we did produce much better work in some ways than the newsletter or the other. So it continues beautifully with everything you're doing now. And PSA on air is very nice, very nice. We've already gotten at least 2 notes from people as if you've seen them. So I think it's thank you all, and thank you, Anna, for this spectacular work that you're doing, and the journalists and everybody.
Jana, that is actually my experience too. In the United States, with teaching Italian authors. Let's teach Dante or Calvino, for instance, is very famous, very popular at the University of Chicago. The rest is basically unacceptable. So the way that I have done it so far, I regularly teach a class on literature and technology, in which I always have Sugira by Pirandello. Always. That's standard. Notebooks of Serafino Gubbio is always on my curriculum. And of course, that's the novel that they hate the most because it's difficult to read, but it's so relevant to what we're living today. This novel is all about seeing the world through a lens, through a screen, being overwhelmed by information from the outside. And this is kind of the time that we're living through right now. We literally communicate through technology, and this is how Pirandello's character in that novel communicated as well. And then when I was in Sicily, all of my colleagues were asking me about, well, who's the most famous author in the United States, the Italian author, who do you read? And I'm like, Elena Ferrante, everyone knows. And then, you know, you have, of course, Dante. They were surprised that Pirandello isn't among those names, because for them, Pirandello is the most important Italian author, the most translated one, the most performed one. Enza, I would like to hear from you as well, and then we can wrap up the conversation.
Yeah, I've just got a small contribution just to finish up. I think it's really important and links up with what Jana was saying about disseminating Pirandello to the new generations. There's also to protect and preserve the use of Sicilian in his works, and as a kind of act to encourage the use of non-standard languages to protect. I think that's really important. And I always have such a special feeling where I talk about Sicilian in China, and I make sure that I teach it because I want to preserve the use of non-standard languages and inspire students to do the same. So that was my final contribution. So thank you.
And so I can only agree with that. Sicily is such a wonderful place, and for me, Pirandello is just Sicilian. That's what he is. All right, thank you everyone so much for your participation and for this rich conversation. I really look forward to talking to you more on these topics and with our guests now in the future. So the next speaker will be Luca Cottini from Villanova University on February 5th, and we will be talking precisely about technology and Italian modernity in Pirandello in the context and how to bring him closer through this topic to our contemporary audiences. And I would like to end with a quote from my favorite novel, which is for me like the Divine Comedy. That's probably all I'm going to study for the rest of my life, the Sigira by Pirandello, with a wonderful quote that kind of inspires us in this difficult time of isolation, of kind of also of an isolating narcissism in so many ways. I feel that Pirandello speaks to us, to this kind of condition we're living in. And the quote is from Quaderni di Serafino Gubbio. Vorrei non parlar mai, accogliere tutto e tutti in questo mio silenzio, ogni pianto, ogni sorriso, perché tutti dentro di me trovassero non solo dei loro dolori, ma anche più delle loro gioie, una tenera pietà che li affratellasse almeno per un momento. The message is that we may receive everyone and everything in our silence, every tear, every smile, so that all might find in us, not only for their griefs, but also and even more for their joys, a tender pity that would make us brothers, if only for a moment. Grazie mille a tutti. A presto, alla prossima. Grazie. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Thank you.
Ciao a tutti, grazie.
Thank you very much for having